Welcome to Conversations. He's Sean Alekian.
And she's Robin Farr. We've got an excellent show for you today.
You are going to love Bruce Cowee. He's our guest. We're going to have him on, just our only guest.
He's the Vietnam War vet you were telling me about, right?
Absolutely. He's written the book, Vietnam to Western Airlines. A bunch of these guys, after they came home from the Vietnam War and were really treated poorly, but they were so skilled that they were given jobs on commercial airliners, and it's just their stories, though. There's 36 guys that are interviewed here, and they're compelling.
I love talking to guys like that because they got so much to say and stories to tell, so I can't wait to meet them.
You're going to love them. But first, we got several letters from viewers this week, and I got to tell you, you brought one. I am prepared for the one that you...
I see that. You brought some books.
I have some advice.
Yeah, we do a little advice segment here. One of our viewers wrote in. She's a younger viewer of ours, and she wrote in saying, I'm a 14-year-old girl who suffers from what I'm afraid is obsessive-compulsive disorder.
OCD.
I have known for 4 years, but I've never told my parents. I finally opened up to them recently and was hoping they would want to help me, but they mocked me instead and told me to get over it. They offered to take me to therapy, but I'm afraid they'll mock me for that too. What do I do?
Okay. See, sometimes people think that if they don't understand something like OCD or anorexia, you know, I've heard parents say to their kid who has anorexia, just eat, you know, or to the one that's got bulimia, so stop purging, as if that's just a simple thing. OCD is pretty serious stuff, and she may have a very small case of it, but if they're offering to let her go to therapy, she really should go, and don't worry about what they're going to say. The therapist will teach them. But you weren't here. This was called BS before Sean. Jeff Bell, he is the obsessive compulsive disorder guru. He's got OCD and he works at KCBS, and he's written 2 books.
He's a broadcaster, he's a fellow broadcaster.
Yes, Rewind, Replay, Repeat is one of his books, and When in Doubt, Make Believe. I want our viewer to get her hands on these books. They're excellent. He is so successful, and how he has, I wouldn't say overcome it, but deals with his situation.
Yeah, he's dealt with this disease. It's a disease or disorder, and he's dealt with it, and he's a huge success. You can hear him here in the Bay Area on KCBS News Radio every day.
He's
an
fabulous,
anchor.
and he was, so what do you say to her?
Okay, my advice to her is, well, first of all, I'm going to tell the parents, getting over it, I'm sorry, that's not a treatment plan. That's
parenting.
not a diagnosis away, and you shouldn't be mocking your kids. I understand that you don't like the fact that, you know, a child has a disorder or is an affliction of some kind, but you need to be supportive. Number one, understand what they're going through and learn. You should go to the therapist appointment with them and educate yourself about this. And don't be dismissive. For the girl, take your parents up on it. Absolutely. Do not run from it. Do not be afraid of it. A lot more people than you think. I'm sure a lot of your friends and you know, classmates are suffering from the same thing. So embrace it, and it's a challenge. You're going to have a lot of challenges in life. You're only 14 years old. Embrace it and tackle it and get over it.
That's exactly what Jeff Bell says. And you know, when I was a kid, I kind of thought I might have something like that. I would lie in bed at night and have to count a certain way, and then I have to do it again and do it again. And it didn't get in the way of my life, but I can certainly see how, if you obsess over it, that it could. So I hope she will, you know, and go see a school counselor. That's another idea.
And don't run from it. Don't be ashamed of it. And your parents should be helping you along the way. And let them know, you know what, Mom, Dad, this is serious. If you just open up to them a little bit and show them how serious you are affected by this, they should get on board with you.
Yeah, do it. And there's some great people who have OCD, so you're in great company. All right, so let's welcome Bruce Cowee. He'll be up, our first and only guest on Conversations, coming right up when Sean and I return. Welcome back to Conversations. As promised, Bruce Cowee is here. Welcome to Conversations. Boy, it's nice to have you here.
Thank you, Robin. Sean.
Bruce is the author of this new book. It's your first book, right?
Yes.
Vietnam to Western Airlines. And this is the story about 36.
There are 37 chapters with 36 authors.
36 authors. Bruce was just kind enough to compile it all. It's their stories and their experiences of having been in Vietnam War, all of them pilots.
Except for the last 2, who were Marine infantry
and yourself included, having pilots, then coming home after a very tumultuous experience, coming home, and many of them, and all of them actually becoming pilots on commercial airline, on Western Airlines.
Right, that was the thread. They all came back. Most of them never knew each other, and they came to Western Airlines and were hired as pilots. And and had long careers. We were very fortunate because it was a tumultuous time for the airline industry. But
was that a big trend back then, that when pilots coming out of war probably got first in line when it came to hiring as commercial airline pilots?
I think at that time, there was a hiring. The airlines always went in cycles in their hiring, and there was a cycle that started in the early to mid 60s, and the military pilots were all in the service and they weren't available. And once they started to separate from the service in the 67 to 68 time frame, then almost all the pilots that were hired through into the mid 70s were Vietnam veterans.
Well, yeah, if you can fly in those tumultuous skies, you can definitely fly in the American air.
That's it. I'm sure everything you did was a lot easier than what you did over in Vietnam.
My class at Western had 30 pilots, and I think 27 were Vietnam veterans, and there were 3 civilians.
Wow.
And that was probably pretty close to 75 to 80, 90% of the pilots hired were Vietnam veterans.
Now this is interesting because this is all happening when Hollywood got their hands on the Vietnam War. They just turned it into, made you all look like a bunch of losers, hippies, drug dealers, rapists, murderers. I mean, you name the movie.
Hooligans.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is what it looked like. And the American public, which is often, their opinion is often shaped by Hollywood, sort of bought into this, and yet you guys were flying them around the country. I mean, irony.
He doesn't look like a hooligan to me.
No, it's not.
Well, it was interesting because I was born in '45, and when I was a kid, we watched Victory at Sea, and we watched John Wayne and Flying Leathernecks and William Bendix and Wake Island, those kind of movies. All of a sudden, the Vietnam movies started with, I think, The Deer Hunter was the first one. And you're talking about drugs and suicide and craziness, and to Apocalypse Now and to Platoon and right on through. And there was never really a positive depiction of Vietnam veterans through that whole time frame.
Well, you having served over there, I'm curious to ask, how much of those depictions were glamorized and were actually true? Because Hollywood, we know, likes to spin things and put their taste, because it's all about ratings and selling tickets. But there must be some factual evidence there. It must be rooted in some fact.
I never could put a finger on it because it was not my experience. And I can only speak from what I saw and what I experienced, but I never saw those kinds of things. And I had an opportunity to speak to a high school class about Vietnam about 4 or 5 years ago. And they were really shocked to know that there was just a regular, normal person that had been a Vietnam veteran. They had no concept of Vietnam except for the movies and for the book they were reading in their class, which was very anti-military, anti-war, that sort of thing.
So this hasn't changed.
Apparently not. And that's kind of been the motivating factor in the book, is that I think people need to know, and maybe some do, but I think there's a need for a positive presentation, and that's what I tried to do to as a tribute to these guys and also to Vietnam veterans in general, and the ones, especially the ones who couldn't come home.
What was it like? You grew up in Berkeley, California, and you're at Cal going to school, and you're with the ROTC. And tell us, pick it up from there. In the 60s, and you go to Vietnam. Tell us, how was that?
One heck of a time in Berkeley.
Well, I graduated from Berkeley High School in 1962, grew up in Berkeley, and went to Cal 62 to 66. And things really didn't heat up until they started taking draft deferments away from single males. And then that kind of stirred up the whole anti-war protest movement, which was probably a lot of anti-draft concern in there too. But being an ROTC then, it was not comfortable wearing a uniform on campus. The whole thing was very, it was a surreal experience, to say the least.
Was that a requirement of ROTC, is that you had to be in full garb day in and day out and ready to go?
No. When we had our classes, academic classes, but when we did our drill, which was weekly, we wore our uniforms, and we used to go out and march on it was the track and field stadium. It was the grass out in the center, and all the ROTC units used that, Navy, Army, and Air Force. But it became impossible because there were people out there throwing things at us and all sorts of stuff. So we had to have our drills in secret locations, like in the basement of the parking lots on Bancroft Avenue, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's so odd. It's as if people thought that a few 20-year-old guys just decided to start a war one day over a mug of beer, and go out there and do something, and that you would be the ones that they should aim their anger at when you returned. Can you explain this?
Well, I think for me, and again, I can just speak from my own experience, but coming of age in the 60s for a young man, you were faced with a lot of decisions. The draft was hanging over everybody's head, and there were lots of ways to deal with it. You could go to college and have a deferment for a while, or commit to go into a military like OCS or OTS or ROTC, one of those officer training programs. Or, there were other options. I had friends from high school that left the country and went to Canada. I even know somebody who renounced his citizenship and left the country. And he's not been able to return to the United States. He can never come back here.
Is he viewed as a defector?
I don't even know what the title would be, but they were real heavy-duty decisions that kids had to, which they don't have to deal with today. I mean, you can live at home till you're 30 or 40 or whatever. I mean, it's a very, very different. But in the 60s, it was you were just right down. You were on a conveyor belt, and you had to make decisions. And the guys in this book were all volunteers. They all made the decision to serve. And no matter where their politics were, what they thought about the war or what they thought about the politicians that were making all the decisions, they all served with honor, and they all were proud of their service. And that's the point that I really would like to make by presenting these stories.
So in Vietnam to Western Airlines, as we read about these 36 veterans and their stories, they don't all have these, even though they have very similar experiences, although the stories are rich, they're wonderful, but they don't have the same, you all don't come back to the same political position. One
would tend to think that these guys would all be pretty conservative because they're military, and the politics are all over the map, and it was never really discussed while the book was being put together, while the stories were being written. It was just an attempt to pay a tribute to them and to pay a tribute to their service. And in my experience, I think you'll see, I think it's chapter 4, the title is Come When Called. And that's kind of a theme, and I can talk about him because he's my only Army pilot. I have one Army pilot, the rest of them are Air Force, Navy, and I've even got 5 Marines, which was a challenge because the Marines are another story. They're amazing.
Yeah, they are.
Booyah mentality.
Well, there was a tendency, for whatever reason, that nobody really talked about Vietnam. And when I was in my class at Western Airlines with all those Vietnam veterans, nobody ever talked about it. You just do hey, where'd you go to school, and were you in the service, and what'd you do? And then we were on to doing other things, and nobody talked about it.
Would you say the underlying theme there then, amongst whether your politics align left or right, and you're in the service at that time, that the underlying theme was we have a job to do, we need to align our ideas and our ideals with what the government wants us to do, and whether we got drafted or we volunteered, this is what we're here to do, just shut up and do your job. There was no, we're gonna, I'm sure there was a lot of, I wasn't around back then, but I know I've heard plenty of stories of Vietnam where you had, the anti-war activists even within the own divisions of the military. But it sounds like from what you're saying, these pilots all we got to go out there and do what we're supposed to do. Yeah.
Well, it was
call to duty.
Yeah, and I think there's a quote from one of the Marines who said he said we all had the same zip code while we served, and recognition for that service is long overdue. And those guys were of all of the stories. The Marines are unique because they deal with other Marines. When they're flying, they're dealing with Marines on the ground, and they were there to defend them, protect them, provide whatever help they needed. And for the Air Force, you had maybe were called in for the same kind of mission, but you were supporting the Army or you were supporting somebody else. But the Marines are just and they're a very, very tight group. And to break in and get them to talk to you, they go to reunions and they talk to each other, but I feel so honored to have the stories that I do, and that those guys trusted me to tell their stories. And So I felt a big obligation to get this published and get it
Because
out.
as an author, they're trusting
Oh,
you big time that you're going to go ahead and
sure.
take their words and not distort them and represent their story. Because a lot of these
Well.
guys have, you know, some incredible stories to tell. They just want it to be told correctly through their own eyes.
I think that's probably a big part of it, sure.
Did you find when you were talking with them that their homecomings were the same as yours? I mean, you came home to Berkeley, so that would be incredibly difficult, but the rest of them were coming from different parts of the country. Was it the same sentiment that they received?
You know, not more than maybe one or two mentioned that. There was a time break where some of the guys who came home in the story started in '64. So the guys who came home in '65, '66 didn't run into what I ran into in '69. And my homecoming is, you talk about surreal, it was bizarre.
Oh,
But I can tell you that if you'd like to hear
Oh,
that
we
story.
I'd love to
want
hear
to
that
hear about
story.
that. Yeah,
that'd be
I'm
a
sure
great
you weren't
story.
at all anticipating it, but theirs were different.
Some were,
receptions.
and some didn't mention it. You know, it's very interesting because a lot of the stories go into great detail about things, and some of the others don't. And my one Marine, he was an infantry officer, was a friend of mine that I met in the 4th grade, and that's why I wanted his story, because he and I were in Vietnam at the exact same time and never knew that either of us were there, and we didn't find out till years later at a high school reunion.
Wow.
And he had wanted to be a pilot and took his physical exams, and the Navy and the Air Force said, no, you're failing the depth perception of your eye test, so he said you can't be a pilot. But then he took the test for the Marine Corps, and they said you passed. So he signed up, joined the Marines, and halfway, about 2/3 of the way through his training, they said, oh, by the way, we need to retake that eye test. And he took it and failed, and they said, well, no problem, we need infantry officers, so you're going to the infantry. So
on the edge of my
I know.
chair.
So-
Exactly.
and his story is pretty incredible. And he's a guy who came back, used his GI Bill to go to law school, and is now a Superior Court judge up in Solano County.
Hold that thought, because we have to cut away to a break. But we're talking with Bruce Cowee, combat war veteran and author of Vietnam to Western Airlines. It's a compelling book. It comes out not coincidentally on Veterans Day, November 11th, 2013, and so I hope you'll all get a copy. But we're going to have Bruce stay with us because we got to hear some of these compelling stories, what's going on. If you'd like to take a look at the website, you can order the book, at least get a pre-order right now, www.vietnamtowesternairlines.com. So don't go away. Bruce and Sean and I will be right back with more conversation. We're talking with Bruce Cowee, combat war veteran and author of this wonderful book, Vietnam to Western Airlines. Bruce, we left a few minutes ago with talking about stories, compelling stories. What were some of the most unusual, surprising tidbits that you received from your fellow?
Well, and keep in mind this is community television, so let's not get too graphic. Let's leave some for the readers at home to get to in the book. But
Well,
there must be some great stories.
they all are. They're all different, and they're all very compelling. But there was a theme that seemed to run through them of service and obligation to their fellow airmen and their fellow soldiers. And I started to mention that chapter 4, Come When Called. And that's a fellow who was an Army helicopter pilot who played football at Cal Berkeley back in the late 50s. And he has a mission that he tells about that is so harrowing. If you put yourself in the cockpit with him, he lands at night to rescue a team that's in the jungle, and he can't find them. So he gets out of his helicopter and goes looking for them in the dark. And I asked him, I said, do you think about that often? And he said, I try not to.
Oh.
And I said, but do you wonder why you did that? And he said, I told them I'd come back for them.
Wow, did he find the team?
He did.
Oh my goodness.
And
And he was how old?
well, at the time he was in probably his mid-20s. These were all a bunch of guys that were in their 20s who were put in situations of incredible danger but excitement, and just performed with incredible performances.
Well, yeah, and if this guy played football in Berkeley back in the 50s, I mean, he was a true leatherhead. I mean, this guy was tough.
When Cal had good football teams, I mean, he played with Joe Cap and
But you
all
Cal
those
fans
guys.
at home right in and call us now about that comment.
Still
but
the #1 public school.
they still have good
You're
teams, right?
Yeah, you're good. Now, you know, we've been looking at pictures of you back in the day, and you know, you're just such a handsome, wonderful photos in here, by the way. That must have been something else, trying to gather the photographs of these guys. They're unbelievable. The overwhelming thing I see from your photographs and from the young men in here is, A, how young they are. I have a 22-year-old son. I cannot imagine him doing what you guys did. But you particularly strike me with the pictures that we've seen today, very happy. Is that just your nature?
Probably so. You know,
Or was it early on in the conflict and the reality?
And maybe you
hadn't
didn't
hit
know
you
what
yet?
you were coming home to. I mean,
no,
what's
actually,
behind
the
that
picture
smile?
of me in the cockpit was taken about a week before I came home. So that was at the very end, and we thought we better go out and take some pictures because, you know, we're going home. So
you just busted out your iPhone and started taking pictures?
well, yeah, that's the other thing.
Poor Sean doesn't know what life was like before.
Yeah,
the
there were
cell phones in Vietnam?
no cell phones, no internet, no computers. It was very, very different than today.
But did you not know what you were coming home to, or is that just the nature of Bruce Cowee?
Well, I think I did know to an extent because we had a newspaper called the Stars and Stripes, which was the military paper. And I knew some of what was going on in Berkeley, and I had letters from my folks and from my sister. But when I got home, my folks picked me up at the San Francisco International Airport, and on the way over, oh, by the way, Berkeley's occupied by the police and National Guard, and we have to go through a roadblock when we go off the exit at University Avenue. And we got stopped at a roadblock, and they weren't letting people in the city unless they could prove they lived there. And it was Highway Patrol, police agencies, National Guard, and
What were you wearing?
I was wearing my uniform, and a highway patrolman came over and checked my dad's ID to make sure he lived in the city, and then he looked at me and said, "I don't think it'd be a good idea to wear your uniform in town."
Yeah.
And that was my welcome home. But
That was the surreal experience
well,
that you were
yeah,
mentioning to me earlier.
the ongoing surreal experience.
I mean, you had just served your country overseas and given, you know, and seen many of your comrades, you know, go through a lot, including yourself, and this is the welcome you're getting coming back home. You know, it was an isolated, you know, incident in Berkeley and other pockets around the country, but still, it must have been really hard to take that.
Well, it was, you know, I had grown up in Berkeley, so I had experienced some of that when I was in ROTC, so it wasn't like an absolute total shock, but it was, it made an impression, I could say that, and it probably planted the seed for some of the things that I've tried to do with this book, although it's taken me a long time to get it done.
That's okay. When you want to do it right, that's what really matters. It reminds me, I had heard from somebody that I don't like very well in Michigan. I was telling about this, and his response, "Oh, what a charming story." So how did he say it? He says, bombing villages, killing civilians, and dropping Agent Orange, and then they come home to these cushy jobs at Western Airlines. Isn't that wonderful? I can't believe there are still people out in the world that think like that, but what do you say?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues. As far as the bombing and killing civilians, there was such tight control over the targeting, and I flew a cargo airplane, so I really can't speak to some of those things because the airplane I flew was a short field takeoff and landing. We went into these 1,000-foot dirt strips and delivered stuff to the Special Forces camps out on the Cambodian, Laotian border. It was a totally different mission. But the guys I know who flew will tell you they had what was called the rules of engagement, ROE, determined everything they could do. And if they violated the rules of engagement, they were threatened with court-martial.
And those came from the higher-ups, usually not even in Vietnam, not even field generals, but from politicians in Washington.
Mostly right from the White House. I mean, they did the targeting. You know, the whiz kids from the Pentagon were in charge of all of that. And so to think that there was anything indiscriminate, or another term you hear is carpet bombing, I mean, those are just misnomers, and it just shows that whoever this fellow is, it doesn't have a clue really about how the war was conducted.
Yeah.
And in terms of cushy jobs. I mean, I don't know. The airline industry was in such turmoil. I have friends that lost their jobs at Eastern, Braniff, Pan Am, and I think, you know, it was just we were a group of guys who had, you know, had very good experience, and we were you know, we were the best qualified for the jobs, and that's why we were hired.
Oh, that's what I sure want sitting in the cockpit. I mean, I can tell you that.
Flown some dangerous missions.
I wish we could talk all day about this. It's such an interesting story. Bruce Cowee, he is the author of Vietnam to Western Airlines. This is an oral history of the air war. 36 of his fellow veterans are featured in 37 chapters in this book. You will want to get your hands on this. You can get an early pre-order on this. It's due to come out on Veterans Day. www.vietnamtowesternairlines.com is the name of the book. The stories are funny. They're compelling. There's wonderful stuff in here, and I thank you for putting it together.
And it's written in a manner that comes from 36 different points of view. It's not just through one author's eyes. So you see it all.
And these guys are wonderful, and they. I just can't thank them enough for trusting me to get this out.
You've done a
And we can't
marvelous
thank
job.
you
We
enough
can't
for putting
thank
the
you.
book together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Bruce Cowee, for being with us today, and happy Veterans Day to you.
Thank you very much.
And to all the other veterans out there.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for this edition of Conversations. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
If you did, please check out our Facebook page at facebook.com/tv30.org and let us know by clicking the like button.
All right, we'll do this again next week. Until then, he's Sean.
And she's Robin. Thanks for joining us.
Goodbye. If you'd like to order a copy of this show, please visit our website at trivalleytv.org.